Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of The Written Page, the podcast where I interview different authors about their works, sometimes literary works, sometimes nonfiction works, and works in general about different topics. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And today we're going to welcome to the show a New York-based music writer who has written on that subject for many prestigious publications over the years. New York Times and Rolling Stone are just two of them, among many others. His biography of Bob Dylan is, in my opinion, one of the best in the market, and his writing on music, everything that I have read that he's written is always readable, interesting, well written, and full of insightful information. And several years ago, back in 2004, I believe, he published a book on the Beatles' 1970 Let It Be album that has been reprinted several times and that right now you can find under the imprint of Bloomsbury Academic in their 33 and a third series. And we are right now in the year of 2020, just around the 50th anniversary of the original release of Let It Be. So this book is, in my opinion, more relevant than ever. The film will be reissued. A documentary has been directed by none other than Peter Jackson. The unreleased recordings, many of them from the sessions, are scheduled to be released as well. And we're going to be talking about all of this with my guest today. Welcome to the show, Steve Matteo. Thanks for answering our call here on The Written Page.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the book that I have in my hand is called Let It Be by Steve Matteo. Bloomsbury Academic put it out, and it's part of their 33 and a third series. I'm really excited about the fact that all of this Let It Be project is going to be revisited finally in the way it deserves. How do you feel about this whole thing, Steve?
Well, I think it's great. I mean, I think people have been waiting for it to be available because the Let It Be film was, obviously released theatrically, and then it was released on VHS and Laserdisc, but it's never been available on DVD or Blu-ray. And over the years at different times, it seemed like maybe it was going to come out. When I did research on the book back in 2003, I interviewed the film's director, Lindsay-Hogg, and he indicated to me that they were going to put something out, that he had been interviewed for special features to go along with a DVD of the book, of the film being reissued, and it never happened. So, it's the only film that they've done that's, not available. Now, of course, the Shea Stadium concert is not available. That was a television show. But, so people have been waiting for this, and the album has been heavily bootlegged through the years. So, and then, of course, there was the Let It Be Naked project that came out. That was a kind of a different spin on the album. But the film has not been available. So they're going to put the original film out and this new film.
Well, I'm really excited about that myself, and we can talk about that in the minutes to come. I would like to go back a little bit in time, Steve, and ask you how your interest in music began. When did that happen? Was it through the Beatles? Was it through Bob Dylan? Could you reminisce a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, I think that I sort of grew up at a time when, pop music in the culture it had a real significance to it, beyond just sort of entertainment. I mean, I was a child sort of listening to, AM radio, in the 60s, when, Top 40 was in its heyday. And a lot of these artists were, just coming up, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, all the Motown music, all the music coming out of California, the Mamas and the Papas, and then into the 70s, then you get more of this sort of kind of progressive FM album-oriented rock. And I think that that's, where I got, more into it deeply, because albums sort of afford you that ability to take a deeper dive. I was the kind of person that I would, read the liner notes and started reading Rolling Stone and, listening to FM radio. And, initially I really wanted to be in radio and pursued that. But I started writing about music. I was in middle school, junior high school, and I'm writing for the school newspaper. And the writing about music sort of overtook my interest in radio, because at the time, in the 80s, radio was sort of becoming very kind of homogenized and playlisted, and there was more freedom. If you wrote about music, you could sort of write whatever you want and kind of write about whatever you wanted to write about. So, obviously it was many years of writing about music for newspapers and magazines, before the opportunity to write my first book on Bob Dylan came about in the mid-'90s, I guess it was. And then the book came out in '98. So that's kind of the short answer, there, kind of, how it happened.
Well, I got to music through my father myself. He's a huge Bob Dylan fan himself and Beatles fan. So that's how I first got my exposure to music. And then through the Beatles, through Dylan, I went back and started listening to other kinds of music. And I myself am deeply interested in jazz, so I understand what you talk about when you mention the importance of albums, for sure. The idea even of concept albums in some cases, goes back to the 50s and Frank Sinatra, for example, and that's the kind of thing that I've always been interested in. And I also read the liner notes and the personnel and all the session information and stuff like that. So I do understand a lot of what you're talking about. Now, you mentioned before that back in 2003, you began doing the research, or you were doing the research for this book on Let It Be. And I wonder, how did this project of writing this book come about, and why did you select specifically the Let It Be album?
Okay. Well, I had written my first book on Bob Dylan, and then I saw there was going to be this series called 33 and a Third that would focus in on one album. And while there would be the occasional book that would focus on one album, the idea of doing a whole series was definitely something new. Now, there had been a couple of publishers who did, 2 or 3 books where they focused in on one album, but not to this extent where there was going to be a whole series. So I contacted the editor, and at first he really wanted me to do a book on Bob Dylan because I had already written a book on Dylan. And I really felt like, I've sort of done that. I'd rather do something else. And he said, well, we don't have a book on Dylan and we don't have a book on the Beatles. And he said, how about a book on the Beatles? And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. And I chose the Let It Be album because, A, nobody had really done a whole book just on the album in the sort of way that the 33 and a Third series kind of rolled out. And I chose Let It Be because it was so unique. It's kind of the end of the Beatles. It's the end of Apple Records for that at that time. The end of the 60s. There was a film. It had been heavily bootlegged. It was sort of in the news again because some of the tapes had been recovered, and Phil Spector was in the news because of the murder trial. That was kind of that news was just starting to unfold. Mm-hmm. So I just thought it was a great story. I think there had been one book that had come out that had put Let It Be and Abbey Road together, and then there was another book that was almost like a transcription diary almost of the whole experience of filming and recording.
The Sulpy book, I guess.
Right. And I wasn't looking to do something like that. I was looking to do something that was more of a narrative. But I mean, the book that you refer to, Doug Sulpy's book, that is really the definitive sort of book. I mean, he covers it in such detail. And I highly recommend people to read that book because it goes into a depth that I think, my book doesn't. It's really, his book is very much a sort of, here's what happened every day, every minute, mm-hmm. So my book was more of a narrative. My book was more of a speaking to the people who were there and telling the story sort of, through their recollections. So So yeah, I mean, in retrospect, I'm really glad that I did it because it remains it remains relevant in terms of it not just being something that happened in 1969 and then it's forgotten. It continues to sort of have a life through the Let It Be Naked and now through this project and through the bootlegs. I mean, it's probably the most heavily bootlegged album. I think the Let It Be album and the Basement tapes and some of the other music that Dylan did with the band, the bootlegs of that are sort of really the foundation, at the base, the cornerstone of sort of the whole, rock music album bootleg industry, for good or bad.
I absolutely agree, and if you look at the amount of bootlegs out on Bob Dylan and the Beatles, and Bruce Springsteen is another one, I feel like that's kind of the three artists that have been the most bootlegged, and it's interesting that the Beatles is part of that, or are part of that, because if you think about it, they didn't really record that much, or at least not for that long. When you think of Springsteen and particularly Dylan, they did record a whole lot more. But in the case of the Beatles, there's a lot less to bootleg, you would think.
Yes. I mean, I think that it's for a number of reasons, is that there's just so much interest in the Beatles. I mean, I don't think there's any group, or artist that there's more interest in. I mean, Dylan probably comes in a close second, but I think the Beatles, there's just so much interest. And then through the years, for various reasons, their music, their unreleased music, has come out, quite a bit. And there's various ways and reasons why it's come out. Some of it too complicated to get into here. But there was a guy named John Barrett who worked at Abbey Road, who was ill, and they were trying to kind of give him something to do, and so he actually listened to almost all the tapes, not as much as Mark Lewison, I believe, and so he chronicled quite a bit of information, but there's some speculation that a good deal of what has gotten out was through him, maybe not directly through him, but through his impetus, in terms of that he listened to this stuff and then he passed away, and someone may have gotten a hold of those tapes. But none of this is anything that we can definitively say. But so there's just so much interest. But I think also because of the fact that Let It Be was a film, and that there was always Nagra tape recorders running all the time, that this created just a tremendous amount of material that was never going to be released under any circumstances. So the interest in that, because of the sheer bulk of it, makes the Beatles, particularly that album, just so bootlegged. I mean, so much too about the Beatles. Once they stopped touring in 1966, is all about the studio. So that's what you have, and that's what people want to hear. And then of course the sort of pre-fame Beatles, before they recorded for George Martin at Abbey Road. All of the Decca audition music, the music that was recorded in Hamburg,
the Quarrymen stuff.
I'm sorry?
The Quarrymen stuff, for example, from the 50s.
The Quarrymen. I mean, the interest in that stuff, and this is at a time when recording is still fairly primitive. We're very much in the mono sort of 3-track mono recordings, or people recording with portable reel to reels. So there's this. It's like archaeology. You know what I'm saying? It's like audio archaeology. And again, I mean, the interest in the Beatles. I mean, there's been books that are just about the Beatles' unreleased recordings. Richie Unterberger is a guy who's written a book. The whole book is just about their unreleased music and film material, and it's the amount of it is just, it's extraordinary.
In the case of Let It Be, also, the fact that the movie wasn't as readily available as the other ones, as Hard Day's Night and Help and Yellow Submarine, I think that also plays a part because it's sort of a movie that some people have viewed as a chronicle of the very end of the Beatles, with a lot of animosity and stuff like that. But in reality, the movie is not easy to find, and so I think the that component of mystery also plays a part, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, I think that the Beatles didn't really care for the film, especially George, and I think it was sort of almost purposely kept off the market for a while. But then I think it just becomes a thing where once they resolved a lot of their business issues and they started releasing things like the anthology and the BBC recordings, I think there was a sense of, I think, with the CD age and then with the vinyl resurgence, I just think that they felt that there were so many other things that they preferred to release first.
Mm-hmm.
And also, Yoko had indicated that, after John passed, she said she was going to try to bring something out every year, for people, of John's either unreleased music or, new versions of things or, all these new formats create new opportunities to put the music back out again and for it to be for, new generations of listeners also. And then we come all the way back full circle, and now we have this incredible resurgence in vinyl. And I think that particularly since Sgt. Pepper, I think that what has been done to reissue the Beatles music has, it's been really great. I mean, these last three projects, the Sgt. Pepper reissue, and then the White Album reissue, and then the Abbey Road reissue. And of course, the material is also available on CD. It's also available in some cases on, Blu-ray audio. Some of it is available to be streamed. So, I think that Apple through Capitol, they're doing, or through EMI. I mean, I think they're doing an excellent job.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that they really have the material, in the case of the Get Back / Let It Be sessions, to do a fantastic job on reissuing, a very interesting box set. And, I don't know how comprehensive it's going to be, but it could be huge, really, if they really were willing to put out absolutely everything there is, which I don't know how many people would be really interested in that. But in any case, the material is there, and I have a feeling that the Let It Be box set is going to be extremely interesting for that reason, to collectors, but also to more casual fans. You mentioned before that as you were preparing this book that I have in my hand, Let It Be by Steve Matteo, part of the 33 and a third series from Bloomsbury, you carried out interviews, and this is very clear in the book. There's a wealth of information that you gathered from interviews with the people who were involved. And beyond the interviews, what other kind of research did you do to prepare the book?
Okay. Well, I mean, I obviously went back and listened to the album. I mean, not to be too obvious. But I also listened to quite a bit of the unreleased material.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't personally a collector of bootleg material of any kind, really. It's not really my thing because I'm really into sound, how records sound, and often bootlegs are inferior in sound because they're illegal recordings. Now, as the years have gone on, I think bootlegs have gotten better. The quality has gotten better, especially with, the ability of doing things digitally, the CD situation. So a number of people who had access to various bootlegs, who are, who is sort of like, that's their thing, they sent me some of this material. So that was very helpful, obviously. And also bootleg material of the film, to be able to see the film, to be able to see some of the material that was filmed but was never actually commercially available. I do have a VHS of Let It Be that I bought when it was when it was available, when that was the only way you could see it.
So do I.
So I do. Okay. So I do have that, and I still have it. I still possess it. I read probably 30 books. Some of it was very, specific to the period. Some of it was just general. Look, Mark Lewison's books on the recording sessions, I think, are invaluable.
Mm-hmm.
I found the book Beatles Gear by Andy Babiak, if you're familiar with that book.
Mm-hmm.
It's a book that is all about the instruments and equipment that the Beatles used. I'm not a musician, but it gave me a real solid background into understanding, what were the studios, what was the equipment, what were the instruments. I was able to get a good feeling for that, even though, again, I'm not a musician. The interviews, obviously, to me, I think is the backbone, because you get to hear the people who were actually there, the people who worked with the Beatles, people who worked at Abbey Road, people that worked at, which then was called EMI,
Mm-hmm.
the people who worked at Apple Records, the people who worked for Brian Epstein. I did not speak with any of the Beatles. I didn't try to interview them. I didn't think it was going to happen. This was at a time when really the Beatles were, the surviving Beatles at that time. I think George had just passed.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just Paul and Ringo, but they don't really cooperate with people who are writing books unless it's people that they have some kind of personal relationship with.
Mm-hmm.
And Apple is very difficult to deal with, from what I understand. They have more lawyers than Disney. So I wasn't looking to write. My book is not a tell-all. It's not a,
mm-hmm.
It's not a book about the dirt and the vices and all that. I don't really get into that. This is a book about the music. It's about
mm-hmm.
the film. That's really what it was about. It's not a 300 or 400 page book. It's a short book. It's meant to be read as a short book. It's meant to be something that you can, easily read. It's not. I don't think it's definitive. I think there has been some other books that have touched on the period. I think there'll be more books. I think once Mark Lewison writes, which will probably be the third volume of his definitive biography
mm-hmm.
of the Beatles, I think he'll cover everything. I did interview Mark for my book, just to get his, take on things, and make sure I'm going in the right direction. Mark is extremely generous with people who write about the Beatles. He's very generous with his time. He's just a marvelous person. He's just incredible. I don't know if you've read the first volume of his biography.
Yes, sir. I actually have, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, I read the expanded version,
mm-hmm.
Which is some 1,600 pages, which was initially only released in England, and then it did receive a limited release, a limited publication in America. And I actually interviewed Mark when that was released, and wrote an article specifically about it. So, I think that's what you do. You talk to people, you listen to music. I talk to so many people who've written about the Beatles. I always think it's good to get, to talk to other authors who've written about the Beatles. I think it's
mm-hmm.
I think it's a good idea.
Absolutely. And one thing I really appreciate about your book is precisely the fact that you concentrate on the music. Because if I am interested in the Beatles, it is mostly because of their music, not so much because of the scandals in their lives and the tell-all kinds of books are not very interesting to me. But a book like yours, I consider to be sort of a crash course on Let It Be, in the sense that, it gives you the chance to appreciate the record and what went into producing and recording and making the record, a whole lot better. And it also gives you a footing on Abbey Road, because Abbey Road is closely linked to the Let It Be project. One question that I've had as I was reading the book is, As you were writing and researching this book, did you gain any new insights throughout this process? Did you come to see the Let It Be project and the movie and the album under a different light in any way?
Well, I think that I understood more specifically the sort of context of the album, that it was the last album released, but not the last album recorded.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might sound obvious, but I think that a lot of people don't realize it. A lot of people think, oh yeah, Let It Be, that was the last album the Beatles made. Yeah, they made that movie and that was the end, So I think that people who know the Beatles music, know that obviously that's not the case. But I think one of the things, and this is, I think, what they want to do with the Peter Jackson movie, is that, quite a few people made it clear that it wasn't all horrible. It wasn't all doom and gloom and misery. Mm-hmm. One of the people I interviewed indicated that, John Lennon would literally just walk into a room and people would fall on the floor laughing because he's such a cut-up, So, there was that sense. I think, too, I think when you listen to music as deeply as that and listen to bootlegs and you hear the sort of songs, evolving. And now a lot of this is available commercially with what has been done with the anthology projects. Mm-hmm. Again, like I indicated before with Sgt. Pepper, with Abbey Road, and with the White Album, you hear a little bit more of how things evolve. And so you really get this, incredible sense of how their music evolves from, just the basics of whatever they have as a song to how it sort of evolves in the studio. So you get a real deep sense of it. And this is such a unique project for them because pretty much everything they did was a studio album recorded at Abbey Road with George Martin. So this is the one album that, they're not recording it at Abbey Road for the most part. They're not working with George Martin for the most part. So it's so unusual. So it's the other albums, while there's obviously a progression and an evolution, the other albums all sort of fit into a pretty set kind of way of doing things. Mm-hmm. The White Album would probably be the other album that is sort of a very different kind of album because it's almost like it at times is almost like 4 solo albums. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And of course it is a double album. It's the only double album that they did. The other 2 albums that are kind of unusual probably are obviously Magical Mystery Tour, mm-hmm. because when it was originally released in England, it was a double EP. And then Capitol Records took some of the other music that was released in 1967 that wasn't part of Sgt. Pepper and created this album, which eventually was adopted also by EMI in England. That's now how it is available in England if you want to buy it, mm-hmm. and how it's been reissued. And then, of course, Yellow Submarine, another one of the soundtrack albums, which is, mostly just a collection of material. It isn't like the Beatles went into the studio to create an album. With the other 2 soundtrack albums, with A Hard Day's Night and Help, there is incidental film instrumental music, but the Beatles, recorded both of those albums as complete albums. Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting. It's interesting. They did 5 movies, And then, of course, there's the Shea Stadium concert, which most of that is filled with overdubs and studio, trickery or whatever you want to call it. That's why they've never put an official Shea Stadium TV soundtrack album out. It's never been done. Now, obviously, after the Beatles broke up, they did put the Hollywood Bowl album out. And then, of course, when the Ron Howard film came out a few years ago, they went back and they redid that. I think they did a great job on that. Mm-hmm. I was actually able to interview Giles Martin, and he told me, how that was done, how they sort of were able to clean up the sound and by cleaning up the sound, reducing the noise of the crowd. And then they added music to it. They added tracks to it that weren't released the first time around. So, Beatle fans are always interested in all of this, sort of music that wasn't part of the official canon, They're just endlessly fascinated by it. And, the evolution of technology allows this material to be sort of cleaned up and fixed up and put out in a way that is a bit more viable and a bit more accessible to a more sort of general commercial audience and the real hardcore fans also.
In that sense, I've always wished that the Ted King-size Taylor tapes from 1962 in Hamburg would be cleaned up and released officially, because that would really provide a snapshot of the Beatles at a very interesting moment. And I was always surprised by the fact, and maybe it was because of the sound quality, that none of that material was ever released as part of the anthology project.
Yes, you're really getting very deep. So, when you say that, are you not talking about the Star Club stuff? You're talking about other material.
Well, I'm talking about both the Star Club stuff that was recorded on stage and also some of the material that was recorded around that time and that has not surfaced.
Right. Okay. From what I understand, I think that there was a point when that Alan Williams had access to those, if I'm getting this correctly, to those Star Club tapes, and actually approached, and this is obviously after the Beatles had broken up, and approached George and Ringo, I believe it was, or George and John, I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly, about putting it out commercially. And they had absolutely no interest in it. And I know that the original albums that came out were bootlegs. I mean, there's no other way to describe it.
Yeah, the Linga song ones that are hard to find these days.
I have that. But then Sony Music did put 2 CDs out of the Star Club stuff in some way that I assume was legal, for lack of a better word. Okay, but then they very quickly went out of print. So I think that stuff hovers somewhere in limbo, and I wouldn't be surprised someday that material does come out. That's just speculation on my part. I don't know anything. I think there's so much other stuff that they will put out before they would ever consider that. You have to understand too that in terms of the whole sort of reissue situation is when reissues are being considered by the Beatles, there's also the solo Beatles. And so that becomes a thing where it's really more the individual Beatles, Paul or Ringo, or John and George's widows, Yoko and Olivia, who are making those kinds of decisions in terms of that material. So while I'm sure there is some kind of coordination that goes on, it seems to me now that there's so much material coming out from the Beatles as a group and as solo artists that I think that stuff now is just sort of, it's just the solo stuff is just kind of put out willy-nilly. I don't think that there really is a real sense of cooperation. I'm not suggesting that there isn't, I'm not suggesting there's any animosity there or there's any sort of unwillingness to cooperate. I just think that there's so much to put out. And what you're going to see now as we enter the initial post-Beatles period, where the McCartney album, Ram, All Things Must Pass.
Plastic Ono Band.
I'm sorry?
Plastic Ono Band from John.
Right. We've already had Imagine. I don't understand why Imagine has already come out in one of these sort of deluxe packages, but I mean, Imagine has been reissued so many times. So, that's kind of what the situation is. So now, we're going to get again a plethora of material. Look, a lot of this stuff has already been reissued. I mean, we've already seen multiple different times where, All Things Must Pass has been reissued on CD or vinyl. You know, where stuff from Paul has been reissued on CD and vinyl. So it just will endlessly come out. So the music that you're referring to, which I think I think it will see the light of day at some point.
You're listening to the voice of Steve Matteo, coming loud and clear from New York State. He is the author of several books. One of them I have in my hand, Let It Be, on the 33 1/3 series from Bloomsbury Academic. And we're talking to him today on the written page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, talking to you from Jackson in Tennessee in the United States of America. And to go back to the Get Back Let It Be project, Steve, you know, the idea of a music film that presents an artist rehearsing for a concert finale is rather typical, you know, of Hollywood musicals. If you think of Singing in the Rain, for example, or, you know, even Elvis, and That's the Way It Is, just a year later, did sort of a very similar thing. It is interesting that the Beatles hadn't been performing live for about 3 years, and now they're wanting to get back into it, and they decide to sort of chronicle absolutely everything. First the rehearsals, and then the idea that there would be a live concert, which it never happened in the way that it originally had been planned. But of course we have the rooftop performance, which is, I think, a very fitting finale and very original one for this movie. And then so we get to see the Beatles, or hear and see the Beatles jamming and joking and chatting and having some problems, of course, as well, but developing songs. And one thing that I have always thought about these sessions, which really fascinate me because of the wealth of material. They go back, they do I Lost My Little Girl, for example, one of the earliest songs that John and Paul wrote. I think it might be a John song, but in any case, one of the earliest Quarrymen songs. And then they also pay tribute to their musical heroes, you know, playing some old country and western and rock and roll tunes that were important to them in the early years. But one of the things that I think is interesting about this album is that George Martin doesn't have much of a presence. He's not involved in this project very much. What impact do you think the absence of George Martin had on these sessions?
Okay. Well, I mean, keep in mind that at first they're sort of rehearsing for a movie, so they're not making a record. Mm-hmm. Okay. So George Martin's presence maybe isn't necessarily needed. Mm-hmm. Okay. Also, there was a sense that they felt that they wanted to get away from the music, how it had become very produced. I think on the White Album, they certainly pulled away. They started to pull away from that, okay? So I think there was a sense of wanting to do things with more of a sense of urgency, okay? Mm-hmm. I also think that they wanted to do things in a more sort of simplistic way. It's amazing how everybody in this sort of period, once the album Music from Big Pink from the band came out, it had a tremendous influence on people, because you have to remember that everybody had gotten very sort of psychedelic and very produced or very heavy. I mean, one of the reasons that Cream broke up was because of Music from Big Pink. Is Clapton heard that and just said, "What am I doing? I mean, this is ridiculous what we're doing here in Cream. This is so loud and self-indulgent. I want no part of it." And so it's a real strong influence, you know, not just in America, but particularly in England, you know. So I think that there was a sense that particularly with John, I believe, of sort of equating George Martin with, you know, the studio and perfection and, you know, instrumentation being experimented with, and, you know, symphonic music and instrumental, orchestral. You know, I think that they just, you know, the Beatles were always just constantly innovating and changing, even if it meant going backwards in some ways, you know. Mm-hmm. So Glyn Johns was sort of the guy who was kind of around to sort of be like the sound guy. You know, he was more around as an engineer than a producer. and but Glenn was and is a producer in his own right. I mean, he produced the Eagles and the Rolling Stones and Eric Clapton, and the list is sort of endless. Okay, and so I think that they just, I think you have to remember they made album after album at Abbey Road with George Martin. So I think there's just a sense of, maybe let's try something new. I mean, the Beatles, they did record outside of Abbey Road. I mean, they did record at different studios, particularly Trident Studios. Mm-hmm. And speaking of Glenn Johns, Olympic, which was a place that that was like his studio. Mm-hmm. And Olympic and Trident they were like some of the first kind of independent recording studios in England, quality recording studios. And I think that Olympic, it started out at one location, then it moved to another location. So, it's like anybody who's creative or anybody just generally in life, I think you just reach a certain point where let's try something new, Now, of course, once Let It Be sort of, didn't really work out, and the Beatles wanted to make another proper album, Paul approached George Martin, and George Martin said, fine, I'll do it, but, we're going to make a real record at Abbey Road, and I'm going to be a real producer, which they agreed with, and obviously the results of Abbey Road bear that out.
And you mentioned that, of course, the original idea was to make a movie or at least a TV special, and so they were rehearsing for that, first at Twickenham, then at Apple Studios, at the Apple building. And to direct this TV special / or eventually movie, they did not call Richard Lester this time around. He had done A Hard Day's Night. He had done Help. He had actually suggested that the Beatles should be the directors themselves of Magical Mystery Tour, as far as I have read. But this time they call Michael Lindsay-Hogg, and I think it probably has a lot to do, the choice of Lindsay-Hogg, with the fact that he had collaborated with the Rolling Stones on that Rock and Roll Circus, in which John and Yoko appeared, and which was also unreleased for years. Do you have a sense of why Michael Lindsay-Hogg was picked for this project, and also what is your view of his work on the project?
Okay. Well, I mean, the Beatles knew Michael for years, because Michael was very involved in the British music TV shows. And Michael had done a number of sort of promo films for the Beatles.
Mm-hmm. At Twickenham, a lot of them, right?
Yes, that's correct. So they knew who he was and had worked with him. And so it really wasn't much of a stretch. I mean, you have to remember now, 1969, it really wasn't like there were people who made music movies. And when I say music movies, I mean more of sort of, how music movies evolved, where it was more about concerts and the rock culture and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So, Michael, I had a chance to interview him for the book, and I've had a chance to spend some time with him. Michael is definitely the kind of person that you enjoy being with him. He's a very nice person. He's very easygoing, very unassuming. I mean, you can see how he's the kind of person that can get along with the Beatles, okay? And the Beatles always kind of like to surround themselves with they were very loyal to the people that they knew. And it was very hard to sort of penetrate their inner circle. So they were not necessarily open to wanting to introduce too many new people into their circle, especially as things went along. So Michael just made sense on so many levels. Interesting, thing about Michael, same thing about Richard Lester, both Americans living in England, okay? Mm-hmm. And there were many of these people, and many of them that crossed paths with the Beatles. Tony Visconti, the record producer, was around at Apple and worked with Badfinger, and he was an American who was in England. A lot of the people connected, oddly enough, with the Beatles through their films were people who were Americans who were in England. A lot of the folks at United Artists who released the first two films and eventually released Let It Be were Americans in England. So, Michael went on, beyond his work with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and beyond his music work, to do all kinds of things as a film director. I mean, he was the director of Brideshead Revisited, which is a major important British television film. So, and Michael's made other films. Michael's an accomplished painter.
Mm-hmm.
He really is he's a really true Renaissance man. Yet very, but no ego. I mean, he's really just a person. I mean, I'm so thrilled that I was able to connect with him for the book and just in general. And he wrote a book that was a memoir. I think it's called Luck and Circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
And I highly recommend reading it because it's wonderfully written. He's a great writer. I'm surprised he hasn't done any more writing because that book is a really wonderful read. I mean, he really is he really is an extraordinarily creative person. And because he's so sort of unassuming and doesn't seek the limelight, I don't think as many people know about him or know who he is. So, Michael just made sense. And when they put the film out, the new film, the Peter Jackson film,
mm-hmm.
when they release it for the home market, they will release the original film also. They're not just going to sort of erase Michael's work and what he's done. Which I think is good. I think it's important.
I agree, and I think it's absolutely important when people started talking about, and it started to transpire in the media that this project with Peter Jackson was coming to fruition. I always thought to myself, well, that's all good and that's all great, and I'm looking forward to watching that, but I'm hoping that they'll put out the original cut by Michael Lindsay-Hogg, because that's the one I've seen and that's the one I have, and I think it really, with the kind of material that he had, in my opinion, he did a great job really of putting together a movie that originally, from reading your book, I hear that was going to be longer.
Well, I mean, I think that directors always want films to be longer, and I think the people who are more the sort of producers and the money people always want to make them shorter because they feel people have short attention spans. And I mean, especially for a rock music movie, and especially one that in parts, frankly, let's be fair, it does move a little slow,
mm-hmm.
Which isn't a problem as far as I'm concerned, but everything is about money. You know what I mean? I mean, part of the reason the film ever came out and the album ever came out was because Alan Klein, who was more or less their manager at the time, even though Paul felt he wasn't, he felt like, let's get this movie out, and it would fulfill the contract for United Artists,
mm-hmm.
because Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine, if I have this correctly, didn't fulfill the contract. Now, I don't know if it was because of the number of films or the kind of films they were, but Let It Be fulfilled the contract. And if we're going to put a movie out, well, for every other movie they've done, they put a soundtrack album out, and that's, how Let It Be was, eventually cobbled together as an album by Phil Spector. Because Glyn had done, and, I was always under the impression that Glyn Johns had done 2 passes on trying to put the album out. But through readings through the years and talking to other people, there actually is 3, if not 4 different versions
mm-hmm.
that Glyn tried to put together, which, I don't know exactly what that even means, and I'm not gonna quantify it specifically or conclusively here, but so that was, a lot of it was Klein. He wanted it out, and he knew it would generate money, and so that's part of the story too, and so much of this has unfolded over the years. I mean, my book came out in 2004, and obviously since then there's been so much more new information about it. I've interviewed a number of people since then that had some kind of connection to the period that obviously they weren't in the book because I didn't have access to them at the time. But so that it's a story that continues to evolve. It's a story that the picture seems to continue to fill in and become clearer as all of this stuff does, because more people come forward and offer, different insights, and I think the Beatles themselves over the years have, have maybe a clearer picture of what happened, or maybe not. Maybe just the opposite. Maybe some of it becomes, sort of like it changes as the years go by to fit, their sort of narrative or whatever.
Well,
Robin Williams said that if you remember the '60s, you weren't there. So.
Well, it constantly evolved even from the beginning. And when we think about the Let It Be project, it was originally called Get Back. And when you're talking about those early mixes, the album was going to be different than what we know now, and it was going to be called Get Back. And the cover, I think, in a very good idea, was going to reference the Please Please Me cover, the original one, but the Beatles exactly in the same positions. Picture also taken by Angus MacBean, and the Beatles now in 1969 instead of 1962. I think that's a wonderful idea. It didn't happen that way, and we finally, through the participation of Phil Spector, we actually had a completely or very different album with even different songs, because some of them were dropped, but and some other added. But the rooftop concert to me is one of the most fascinating parts of this project. It always has been. I also have bootlegs of the whole performance, which happened on January 30th. 1969. Around lunchtime, it was cut short by the police, as you very interestingly describe in the book. It is the last official concert by the group, and it actually happened on the Apple Building rooftop. Very briefly, how did this idea come up, and also, what is your view of the concert? What do you think about the performances, since I'm sure you've heard it several times to prepare for this book?
I mean, the impetus for the whole Get Back project was when the Beatles did the the Hey Jude promo clip, which I guess was originally shown on the David Frost show in England. And they, even though it wasn't entirely live, they just really enjoyed doing it, and they hadn't performed in such a long time. So they decided to do some kind of concert of some kind. And that's where the idea came to rehearse. And then that's where the idea then came to let's film it. But then, of course, that didn't work out, and George Harrison was the driving force behind let's get out of Twickenham and let's go to Apple and let's just maybe try to make a proper album and do some proper kinds of recordings. So that's a very short version of all of that. So when they sort of, concluded that they were kind of done at a certain point in the recording process of Get Back, or Let It Be as it came to be known, the idea of still doing some kind of concert was on their mind, and what they just figured is, look, rather than, go to the pyramids or go to Mount Everest or rent out the QE2, let's just go up to the roof. Because then there's nothing to it. You know what I'm saying? There's no pressure. There's no security. There's no who do we let in and who don't we let in, and we don't announce it. I mean, a lot of that is the reason why they did it that way. Let's say they decided, okay, you know what? We're in London. We'll do a concert at the Roundhouse, or we'll do a concert at the Royal Albert Hall, or the Hammersmith Odeon, or one of those nice concert hall places in England. It would have been insane. It would have been absolutely insanity, okay? People would have killed to get a ticket, to get in for it. The hype, the security, and they knew that. The pressure of it would have been, whatever they did they would have been crucified for it. It never would have been good enough. But if the four of us just go up on the roof and play for a half an hour, basically the same 3 or 4 songs, then whatever we do, whatever it is, people will not be able to criticize it. I mean, I think people generally agree that it was really good. I mean, obviously they were under-rehearsed. It was very ragged. It wasn't recorded under the best circumstances. But I think generally people felt like, we get to see these guys play together, even in this kind of informal, sort of amateurish kind of way. So I think that's kind of the feeling of it. When they put the Let It Be Naked out, I was surprised that they didn't just release the entire concert. I mean, I think that when they put Let It Be out as a box set, other than the film part of it, I mean, I think what they should do is they should put out the original album. Mm-hmm. They should put the naked version out again. They should put the entire rooftop concert, and then another 1 or 2 discs of the best of all the other material that they did, whether it's their own songs or covers of other people's material. I mean, obviously the best of the stuff that they did, that was the Abbey Road stuff, has already come out. I think anything that ended up on the solo albums, they probably won't do, because they'll probably want to save that for the solo albums, or that stuff has already come out. So I think that's what we could hope for. I mean, it would just make sense, but who knows?
As it turned out, Steve, I've always had the feeling that the rooftop performance actually blurs the distinction between the rehearsals and the actual finale, in the sense that sometimes it feels, because they're playing, as you said, several versions of the same songs in some cases, it's always felt to me like it was somehow also part of the rehearsals, the rooftop performance itself.
Yes, you could definitely say that. I agree. I think that's a very sort of insightful observation. Yeah. And, I think that's part of the appeal, of the positive appeal of Let It Be, is this sense of, kind of peeking in on these guys, I mean, because when they did record in the studio, there really wasn't cameras. I mean, other than things like, obviously, All You Need Is Love. Mm-hmm. There really weren't cameras around. They really didn't want people around. That was sort of their sanctuary, where everybody would be kept away, So this was an opportunity to sort of, be the fly on the wall, which is what they call that bonus disc that came with the Let It Be Naked project, which I thought was very poorly conceived, because it's just kind of snippets of things. And I think that it was a real missed opportunity, and I think most people agree with that. I will say this, though, that if you have a copy of the Let It Be Naked on vinyl, then that is a little treasure, because it is completely out of print. It's very hard to come by. It's very expensive. And the reason why is, and I never realized this until years later, is that it is in mono. And so that's a rarity. And I wish I had picked one up at the time.
Well, I didn't, but my father did. So I will eventually have a copy of it, I suppose. But I see what you mean, and that's really something to think about. Now, Steve, but before we finish, I would keep talking to you for hours and hours, and because you have such deep knowledge about this album, and it's actually an album that I really like, that's really close to my heart. It's actually one of the very first Beatles albums that I ever heard growing up. And but we can't finish our conversation without mentioning 2 people, and one of them is Billy Preston. I've always felt like the sound of the Beatles here is in so many ways unique because of the addition of Billy Preston. What part do you think, from your own perspective, that Billy Preston plays in these sessions, both personally and musically as well?
Well, I mean, the Beatles knew Billy for a long time. I mean, they had run across him in their early days. So he was somebody that they were very aware of. It wasn't like they just, had recently been introduced to him, okay? And so he happened to be in England, and I believe he was performing with Ray Charles at the time. He was in Ray's band. And so I think it was John and George, if I'm not mistaken, went to see him perform. And George was the one who told him to drop by. And I think that George was smart in doing that, because I think that he realized that, that would bring something different to the proceedings, that Billy's kind of vibe, he's just such a beautiful person. I mean, he's just I've met him, I've interviewed him. He is just one of those people that is just, he's a special human being. And so I think that, George felt that it would be perfect to bring him around because things were a bit tense. Now, I don't know if he thought for sure that Billy would play on the album or to what extent he would play on the album, but he definitely brings a certain kind of looseness to the proceedings. I mean, a little bit of sort of improvisation. I mean, it wasn't, the Beatles always, it was just the four of them. I mean, yes, there's times when they brought in orchestras or they brought in a flute player or something like that, but not where it was somebody to sort of jam like that. I mean, obviously Eric Clapton brings his very distinctive guitar to While My Guitar Gently Weeps, but they'd never really done anything like this before. This really was something different. And I think, on a song particularly like a song like Get Back, I mean, he brings this real kind of, he brings a funkiness to it, a looseness to it. I mean, look, let's face it, they're four English guys, four white guys. And so you bring this American black guy steeped in R&B and soul, and he is obviously going to bring something really very fresh to the proceedings. Now, Billy has worked with the Rolling Stones. I saw Billy perform with Eric Clapton. I mean, he's just one of those people that is just, he's magic. I mean, he just is. And people love working with him, particularly the English musicians, because he can bring something to the show that really is different than what they bring. And, they're fans of him and they're fans of American black music. So, Billy is like a bridge between the early days of American R&B and soul and continued on for decades. So, he's one of the great things about the Let It Be album, and I think I'm glad you pointed that out.
In many ways, he embodies the American music that actually sparked the Beatles' interest in music and actually shaped the early sound of the Beatles. And I think that's really interesting from that perspective, especially if you think about the fact that the Beatles are actually going back to their roots in some of the songs that they're performing as they rehearse at Twickenham and at Apple. To me, those early versions of songs and songs by Bob Dylan and even early tunes like George Formby's Leaning on a Lamppost give you the idea of the breadth of musical knowledge and influences that actually shaped the Beatles' music from the very beginning.
Yes, there's so many influences. I mean, they're influenced by country and western and show music and then of course all of the sort of early American rock and roll, R&B, soul. I think a lot of the major influence that helped them evolve into something original and sophisticated was the sort of the harmonies of the Everly Brothers, the songwriting of Buddy Holly, and then the production that Phil Spector brings to the girl groups. And Roy Orbison, too. I think the production on his records and his great vocals. So yes, so many different influences.
Now, the other person is Phil Spector, of course, and you just mentioned him, and we can't finish this episode of The Written Page without mentioning Phil Spector. Now, Phil Spector is a man that I have admired for a very long time, because if you can define a genius by the fact that it's somebody that takes something that was already there but makes it new, and makes it different, and goes beyond what was already there to create something new and different. That is what Phil Spector did with his Wall of Sound and those productions that you were mentioning with the girl groups in the early 1960s, even before the Beatles became famous. And now after the project had been shelved temporarily and they had gone back to the studio for Abbey Road, the final album to be recorded, although not released, now Phil Spector steps in to turn this Get Back project, or at some point it was already clear that it was going to be called Let It Be, but he steps in and he turns the project into what was finally released in 1970, angering Paul McCartney in the process, apparently. Beyond the fact that the Beatles admired Phil Spector and knew his music and his productions, Why do you think he particularly was called in, and what do you think of his approach, the approach that he brought to the project? Because in my view, the Get Back project, as it was mixed by Glenn Johns, it really wasn't up to the Beatles standards, and I think that Phil Spector does something with whatever little he had to turn it into something that is sellable and that can be produced as an album. What do you think about Phil Spector as related to the Let It Be project?
Well, some of them had already worked with Phil. I interviewed Klaus Bormann, and he talked about how Phil basically came in and rescued Instant Karma because John was really struggling with it. He was really happy with the song, but he was not happy with what was going on in the studio. So obviously, I think George was really the impetus. But I think that Alan Klein had a relationship with Phil Spector, too. Mm-hmm. And I think he was part of the impetus. And, of course, John went along. Now, I don't think Paul was necessarily adverse to the idea initially, but then when he heard the choirs and the strings, I don't think he was happy about it. I mean, I liked what was done with the Let It Be Naked because the album flows a bit more. It's a bit more cleaned up. But on the other hand, I think it loses a certain amount of its charm with all the little extras and the voices and the little ad-libs and the roughness of it. And I like the sort of production on, the Long and Winding Road and the sort of the drama of the strings and all of that. I mean, it's very much sort of befitting of that period of the sort of the 60s are ending. There's almost a sort of companion to, kind of Let It Be in the Long and Winding Road. And I think that's Bridge Over Troubled Waters by Simon and Garfunkel. Mm-hmm. I think there's definitely this sense of there's this heaviness of it and this feeling of we're leaving this decade, this monumental decade, And so I'm a huge fan of Spector, the producer, I mean, the girl group stuff, the Christmas album, you listen to the work that he does with John Lennon on the solo albums. It's very different than the sort of, big production wall of sound. So he's capable of doing things that are not just big and grandiose. I mean, he produced All Things Must Pass. Mm-hmm. I mean, the production on that is that's truly great. That may be his, other than some of the girl group stuff, or the stuff he did with the Righteous Brothers or Ike and Tina Turner, the All Things Must Pass album, that may be his greatest work.
And it actually has roots in these sessions right here that we're talking about, since, a lot of the songs, or several of the songs, were demoed and debuted during the January 1969 sessions. You're listening to a new episode of the Written Page. Our guest today is Steve Matteo, who has published this wonderful book about the Let It Be sessions, the Let It Be album by the Beatles, published by Bloomsbury Academic, 33 1/3 series, a book that I have read several times, and, well, we're coming upon the 50th anniversary of the release, not of the sessions, but of the release of Let It Be in 1970, and I really think this book is an absolutely essential read in the sense that, as I said before, it's like a crash course on the Let It Be sessions and the Let It Be album. And I think if you listen to the album and you read the book and then you listen to the album again, you will get a completely different insight. You will enjoy the album just a little bit more, if that is possible, because of the reading of this book. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And in closing, Steve, I would like to give you a chance to, if anybody out there doesn't have this book, before they seek it out and before they read it, somebody that has not read it yet, what will they find in this book, Let It Be by Steve Matteo, Bloomsbury Academic?
Well, I think that the people that I talked to who were there, I think their voices, to hear what they had to say, I think is important, and I think is insightful. I mean, the book is really not much on the way of my opinions. I mean, that's just generally the way that I write anyway. I'm a journalist. I'm not a critic. So I think it'll take you to that time, and bring you sort of to the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s. I think the book is very much written as if it was a documentary, which Let It Be was. That's kind of how I tried to write it. I mean, it's kind of like a documentary text or a documentary on the page. So I think that's where it's at. It's a very short read. I think what it'll do is I think it'll spur you to want to go and read other books on the Beatles. There's a very extensive discography and a bibliography in the book. And I've mentioned a few other books here that I would highly recommend that you read my book, but then go and seek out those other books, because some of them will just shed more light on this period, and it will shed more light on the history of the Beatles.
And there's about 4 pages of bibliography at the end, and it really it really is something that will happen. If you read this book, you'll try to find more books about the subject, and you may be compelled to dust off your copy of Let It Be even more often, and that's something that this book does to any reader of it. Now, Steve, any current projects that you're working on that you can talk about, or maybe we'll leave that for some other time?
Well, I mean, I continue to write about music. I write a lot about reissues. So I write for different publications. Most of them are online these days. I mean, if you Google me, Steve Matteo, Matteo, music, Beatles, I think you'll find my work. I mean, I continue to write journalism. I often will appear on the radio. So there's a lot of me out there in the internet. So if you just Google me, I think you'll find me. If anybody really needs to, contact me directly, they can contact me through you. I'd be happy to connect with anybody. I don't have a website, but I am out there. You can easily find me.
Well, one thing I can say, you have been extremely kind and nice and approachable, and that's not always the case. I've been doing these interviews for several years, and it's not always easy to get in touch with some people, and some people are never sure if they want to do a conversation, leave aside an hour or hour and a half to talk about their work. And I really appreciate the fact that you have been so approachable, and it's been an absolute pleasure for me, Steve, to chat with you. And any time that you want to come back to the show, you're perpetually invited to do so.
Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, this is great. You're obviously very knowledgeable and passionate. And I mean, obviously a conversation like this, it's about music, but it's also about books. So, that I love, and I'd love to do the show again sometime.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a new episode of the Written Page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and this will be available on my YouTube channel, Anton GF, very soon. Our guest today on the Written Page has been Steve Matteo. His book, Let It Be by Steve Matteo, in the 33 1/3 series from Bloomsbury Academic, was the excuse that we needed. Not that we really needed one, but this was the excuse to chat about the Beatles and the Let It Be project. And of course, check this book out, seek it out. It's easy to find, and it really is a pleasure to read. Once again, Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez. Mine is the copyright of this conversation, recorded in Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America in the month of June of the year 2020. Available very soon on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. Thank you very much for listening. Time now to dust off the Let It Be album, read Steve's book, and for now, so long, everybody.